Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to let everybody know that I'm calling the meeting to order. I'd like to start off with getting an approval of the agenda, if I could. Councillor Neal, and seconded by Councillor Schell. Do we have a confirmation of the minutes from the May 9th? Oh, sorry. We have to. Sorry, I'm skipping through. Can we vote on the agenda? All those in favor? Passes unanimously. Confirmation of the minutes. Councillor Neal and Councillor Schell. Those that approve? That passes unanimously. Any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, we have a delegation. Afraj Jill, VP Strategy, Drop Bike, will speak to the committee regarding Drop Bike Share Initiative.
Well, you can ask them. They don't have to.
Okay.
Speaking
I think just to make I was basically thinking about doing a demonstration of the bicycle, and maybe if it's possible for you to maybe come around the bike, it might be easier if you're interested. Okay.
I'm just going to take a picture of it.
We're just commenting on the beautiful EITP orange that. Yes, of course. So Brian's got so Drop Bike, we'll give you a demonstration, right? And I'm sure it's boss.
Is it possible to speak? Sorry, sure. Just because then it goes short.
I might have to do a demo, in which case I'll go there. But so Drop Bike, in comparison to the conventional bike sharing systems you might be familiar with, is free from physical docks. So maybe I can show you how it works. So I have the Drop Bike smartphone application here on my phone, right here. So I'm just launching it. And there it is. So let's imagine I'm walking around, the city. By the way, a quick background: I spent 5 years living here. Went to Queens. Big fan of the city, especially in the summer. So I'm walking around. What I can see is the nearest. Basically, I need to look for a bike. I launch the application. I check where the nearest bike is. I click unlock. I walk up to the bike. So once you finish riding the bike, we don't want people to just leave these bikes anywhere, especially in the middle of sidewalks, etc. So what we require our riders to do is find a bike rack or bike post that is pre-registered in the Drop Bike application. So how do you do that? Well, let's say you're done riding. This is a screen you'll see, right? And you basically look at the screen, and it'll tell you where the nearest Drop Bike haven is. So a Drop Bike haven is simply a bike rack or bike post that you're allowed to park these bikes at, right? Again, we do this because we don't want people to just leave the bikes anywhere. So these are virtual docks, if you will, and we work with the city to figure out where these are going to be. So actually, we have a hypothesis here. So that's McDonald Park, some in Queen's University, some along, King and Princess. But again, this is kind of like a preliminary kind of thought. But the point here is to show you that, let's say we decide that, oh, you know what, maybe we should change a couple of spots. For us, it's very simple to do that because we have a soft piece of software, right? So anyway, you're done riding. You click End Trip. And now what we do is we ask the user, so the first thing we ask them to do is block the bike first. You scramble the code, and then you click enter, and now you have to take a picture of the bike. Take a picture next to the drop bike haven, and that's it. You're done. That's what Kingston's drop bike. So it might be, so that's the demonstration. It might be worth zooming into a couple of things. First, why did we ask you to take a picture? That's actually very important. So there's a few reasons. First, psychologically, we deter misconduct on the system. When you know as a rider that at the end of your trip you have to take a picture, you might treat the bike with a bit more respect. But more importantly, we actually get location coordinates where the drop bike has been left, the exact longitude and latitude. So now we know the last rider to have used the bike, where the bike was left, and finally, the exact the condition of the bike, because we have a picture, right? So the second point I'll bring up is in terms of cost to the rider, because we have removed the most expensive part of a sort of conventional bike share system, the physical dock, riders can ride this for just $1 per hour. And finally, it might be worth actually talking about walking you through some of the features, if you will, of the bike to kind of illustrate how much thought we put into this. So this bike actually has foam-based tires. They don't go flat. And every screw on the bike is anti-theft, so it requires a special screwdriver that only we have at Drop Bike to unscrew something. More importantly, every part on the bike is a non-standard part, so that disincentivizes sort of thieves. If you take the pedals, there's really nothing much you can do with them. And the rear light is actually interesting. The rear light, the entire module, has a solar panel, an accelerometer, and an ambient light sensor built right into the piece that's this big on the rear sort of tire. So when you're riding at night, it'll light up. There's front and rear reflectors, etc. The point is we've sort of met all the regulatory requirements, of course, in the bike. The seat's adjustable, so on and so forth. We have a unibody bell that is just more ergonomic for riders. And so that's Drop Bike. It's green, it's healthy, it's convenient, it's affordable, and it's accessible. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer questions. Right. So the antenna is sort of just out for our showcase bikes. We have some of these in our office, and we have a Drop Bike flag that we put on the antennas. But yeah, so basically it serves no purpose. It's just. Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Holland.
Hi. Thanks very much for the presentation. Really, really fascinating. So I think you were about to speak to us about how the payment system works.
Right.
Are you registered through the app? And if you could just maybe talk about what any potential privacy issues there might be with anyone using the app and all the data required for this.
Okay. So when you sign up for Drop Bike, you input your credit card information. So we actually use a company called Stripe. So Stripe is actually an industry leader in the payment space. A lot of technology companies use Stripe as a payment method, as a payment platform. In fact, some, I guess, prominent examples would be Uber, until they got so big that they decided to build their own payment infrastructure. So we actually follow Stripe's privacy policy when it comes to credit card information and financial information. In terms of data, we don't, as a company, we're strictly against. The only thing that we are okay with doing with data is sharing with the city with which we're working with. So anonymized data about where the bikes are being ridden, for example. So maybe there's interesting things there. Maybe we'll be able to identify, for example, McDonald Park has a lot of activity in terms of biking, but there are only X number of bike racks and bike posts. So that's something just good to be aware of. But that's sort of we don't sell and do not intend on selling this data at all. I mean, this is actually on our website. We put up our privacy policy and terms and conditions. So that's up, and obviously it's going to be in the smartphone application too.
Councillor Neal.
Yeah, very quickly. So the usage is dependent on a smartphone. The reason I ask that is, as a former resident of Kingston, I'm sure you're aware that we have a very strong anti-poverty activist group in town. And I can foresee there being a complaint that only people with smartphones are going to have access to this, which may be a complaint, may be problematic if people are frustrated because they can't use the bike. There might be greater bike vandalism kind of thing, and I don't know how you might be able to address that issue.
That's a good point, and that's obviously, that's something we've definitely thought about. I mean, I think the thing I'll say to that is, because of the smartphone, we're able to remove such a large cost from the, i.e. physical docs, right? I think there might be interesting things we can do in the future to navigate around that. Perhaps having some sort of smart card technology, something that's more physical. But for now, because the value in this model, of course, there's a lot of interesting things that I can walk you through that we can do, but the value in this model is a low cost, right? And by low cost, I mean not just for the riders, but as a company, we don't require subsidies from cities, because as a business, we can actually operate this type of model, right? It's something we're aware of, but we don't have a good answer for, at least for the pilot.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I don't think it would be a huge issue for your Queen's University or St. Lawrence College or RMC clients, but this may become less effective in other areas of the city. For instance, the North End may not have a lot of utilization of this service.
No, and I think that's good to be aware. That's good to hear, and this is something we're definitely going to tackle. I think, again, as a company, that's just sort of we're right now. What we're focused on is, let's see if we can make this work at a small scale. That's what we're focused on, and we'll have small learnings. I wish we had the resources. I mean, we've built an Android app, an iOS app, which some companies take over 24 months to build, and we've built that in the past 30 days. We've been working around the clock as a team, and I wish we had the resources to, or the bandwidth to build something that was, non-smartphone, and I'm sure we will. But again, for the pilot, it's going to be purely smartphone focused.
I understand that this is the first model and that there's a second model being planned. And this is the model that I saw quite a bit last time I was in Toronto. In the downtown, I saw a number of these right next to the Dixie bike stands, in fact, and which I thought was smart marketing. But I'm just curious what the next iteration, the next model will have that this model doesn't.
Right. So a few things. Again, I think how we, just as a pre-context, how we work as a company is with the sort of, the entrepreneurial mindset, which is, let's learn from feedback. Let's learn from the pilot. So some of the feedback that we've gotten, which we're going to implement, which we've decided to implement, is so these bikes actually have 24-inch tires. So our next generation of bikes will have 26-inch tires. But somebody actually said, wait a minute, I really like these tires. I don't want the 26-inch tires. So then our response was, okay, that's interesting. Maybe that means we should have a mix of bikes, because I prefer the 24-inch tires. But my brother, who's like 6'5", he can't really ride this comfortably. So that's one feedback. The other is it's a single gear bike, right? So multi-gear is definitely a need as well because it depends on where you're riding the bike. That's also something we'll add. So 3-gear bikes is something that we're looking into. Actually, we've decided we're going to do in the next generation of bikes. And I'm sure we'll come up with creative ideas. So for example, solar panels, this wasn't something we were going to do 2 months ago. But it's interesting. There's, it's a creative power supply that we can have.
And where you have tried it out in Toronto, do you have much issue with vandalism, bike theft, damaging? Because it is a kind of drop bike is exactly that. You just drop it wherever.
Well, we don't let people do that, and I'll explain why. We won't let you end your trip if you're not at a designated haven. That's really important. So if you try to end your trip somewhere where you shouldn't be, 2 things. First, we won't let you end it. Second, if you choose to end it anyway, which we give you the option for, it's flagged in our system. Wait a minute, why is there a user or a rider who decided to end the trip despite not being at a designated haven? We'll look into that. Our operations team will be identified. We're actually going to have, we call them drop bike warriors. We're going to have them around the city, 6 to 8 of them. And these are part-time students and people from the community. And they'll put the bike where it should be. But, sorry, coming to your point about the Toronto, so we're actually not launched in the city of Toronto. Those bikes were just outside our office. We're doing a pilot at the University of Toronto, and that's going to be starting soon. But I think it's important to just be aware that we're doing whatever we can as a company to make sure people don't just leave these anywhere. So we have on-the-ground operations team, and on top of that, we're using the power of software to discourage bad behavior.
And I know your original proposal was to have a 60-day trial or whatever.
Right.
If I could strongly suggest that if you could have something that would run over the summer tourist season and the student time would be great.
So we are actually doing that, and so 120. So the terms, we're thinking about like 120 days or until October 16th, whichever comes first. So that actually solves that problem because we prefer that too. I mean, we want to see what happens when people in Queens start school in September.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you. I read your the piece you sent out before this one. It was a little unclear to me how the bikes are locked up.
Right.
You actually have a lock when you're on the app. You can get the.
Right. So the
It's okay.
So the lock, it's an onboard lock that locks around the rear tire.
Like a normal lock. Like what was unclear to me is whether you also were locking them from source.
You mean from the app?
Yeah.
So not these locks. Oh, sorry. Actually, coming back to the other question, future bikes. The future bikes will have GPS and Bluetooth-enabled locks as well. And the way that's actually different is that with these locks, we know where you've left the bike. So we know the location of the bike before and after a trip. But with GPS and Bluetooth locks, we know the exact route traveled. And that's more valuable to the city because that's more valuable data, right? Sorry, coming back to your question about from the source. So with these locks, these are manual locks. The app will tell you the combination once you scan the QR code, and you simply plug in the combination and you press a button and the onboard lock unlocks. For future generation bikes, that won't be a need. You'll simply press a button. You won't need to put in a combination because it'll be an electronic Bluetooth GPS-enabled lock.
That was the impression I got from the written thing, but it seemed to be a combination. I wasn't quite sure how it worked.
Okay.
My next question is this. You have costs. You have to buy the bikes. You've got overhead. You've got an operations team.
Right.
You got to pay these people. Presumably you want to pay yourselves. So, at $1 an hour, how are you making money?
Yeah. So if you actually look at the operations plan, that's the document with the gentleman on the front. There's a section in there that talks about the business model, and at the very end, in the last paragraph, you'll see some of the cost breakdown. So we get this question often, which is, well, $1 per hour. Wait a minute, why does that make sense? So we've run the unit economics on this, and if we can actually survive as a business and be profitable potentially if we do 2 rides per bike per day for 8 rideable months a year. Now, that being said, again, the purpose of the pilot is to learn. So if $1 is too low, maybe we'll have to do $2, but we don't foresee having to go beyond that. And 2 rides per bike per day, how do we get that number? So in Washington, for example, there's actually 4 rides per bike per day. This is basically the industry standard, but a more conservative estimate. Anyway, we've put a lot of sort of thought, our finance team has put a lot of thought into making sure that the unit economics work out. And we're venture backed as well, of course. So we're not just going to disappear.
Right, well, that is a concern, right? Whether you're actually covering your costs and making
Right.
something.
Absolutely.
Let me think now. You have, it doesn't matter. No,
Seeing no further questions, thank you, Mr. Gill.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Neal?
I'd like to move for an additional delegation on behalf of Keith Roger Healy, who chairs the working group on active transportation. So if there's a seconder.
We have a seconder, Councillor Schell. All those in favor? Great. That approves.
And I would also like to include Tom Carpenter if he wishes to comment. He's the chair of Keith.
Okay.
So.
Hi. I was only going to come tonight, but we were told that only I, as chair, could speak to this matter as Keith, and that Roger could speak as a citizen. I'm going to tell you that what Roger is going to explain to you in some detail is the substance of the conversation that we had at Keith, and it goes to the motion that we brought forward and referred on to you. And I wanted to further say that there are 2 parts to that. I'll read them if you like. The bridge, I won't read them, you can read them. If you have questions about how Keith arrived at the wording of those, the issues are essentially, was the right question asked to bring us to the answers that we're now looking at with regard to the 3rd question? Was the right question asked? And our contention at Keith, our conclusion, the consensus at Keith was that no, that's not obviously the case. And the second point we were making is that in the light of many things that are going on right now, this whole issue is poorly timed for a final decision, and that it's worth having that in mind as you deliberate whenever it is you're going to. I'd further say that Keith was given about 4 hours to look at this question one way or another. I can't reproduce for you all the ways in which the time frame telescoped into one meeting that was then called early. But there was more in people's minds than we had simply time to express and bring forward to you. So I'll leave it with that. I'm happy to take questions later about the 2 points that we raised specifically, and then I hope you'll listen to Roger's delegation as a citizen with the fact in mind that he was doing this as preparatory work to our Keith deliberations.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I'll just quickly page through this and stop me if there's anything we can talk about it later. The Kingston Transportation Master Plan of 2015, there were there was a version in 2004, then one in 2009, and an update in 2015. And it forms it's one of the foundation documents of the third crossing modeling. The 2015 KTMP was seriously flawed. I think you probably remember it took about a year to get through committee and council. It didn't update a 2008 household travel survey. That's one of the most important flaws. Just think of why would we make financial decisions based on 2008 data when we clearly could update it. Some of the modeling I'll explain later. They basically assuming 74% of mode share in cars. The few other flaws with that whole study was that the major upgrades to transit were not incorporated. And as we know, transit has made some tremendous improvements in the last few years. And there was no discussion of greenhouse gases. BAU means business as usual. It was a business as usual document. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. Everything's fine. It didn't take into account the fact that we've just signed on to the Paris Accord and that we were going to try to reduce greenhouse gases. It had very little consideration of what we know is coming as transformational technology. There was also using population projections didn't factor in 30,000 students. I just mentioned that Kingston's road network as it is oversupplied because it was designed on level of service D, which means that even at peak capacity, we only have 90% of the roads being used. So that would mean that if you had a restaurant, you would keep 10% of your tables empty permanently, even at your peak time. I don't think that's a good business plan. So that's why I think we're oversupplied. That changed in the EA for the third crossing was evaluated using the same level of service D because that was in effect in 2012. In the 2015 Kingston Master Plan, Transportation Master Plan, we went to level of service E, which means that we would have 100% capacity at peak, only at the peak times.
1 minute.
Okay. But engineering did their jobs. We asked them in 2010 to investigate the feasibility of implementation, additional transportation capacity across Cataraqui River. And we know that with what we should have asked them was that they would include all these things that we now know are necessary to reduce single occupancy vehicles.
Point of order. Given the complexity of this and the importance of this, I would like to move to give the speaker an additional 3 minutes, if I have a seconder.
Seconded by Councillor Schell. All in favor?
Thank
Granted.
you.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's a little bit complicated, so thank you very much. We should have asked the question differently, and this is basically a reminder of what the financial model for proposed in the Kingston Transportation Master Plan, and you'll see on the far right that the ones in red brackets are what the council changed in the Transportation Master Plan. They upped those mode shares, and they made it so it's quite a significant difference. And the plan still calls for $750 million being spent in the next until 2034. So next 15 years. So The main thing, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the two major papers on fundamental law of road congestion, and when it's talked about as a law, it's probably pretty sure. So in other words, this is to put it simply. So two economists from the University of Toronto did this in 2009. They basically looked at U.S. data for the last 40, 50 years and said I just highlighted in red, we find that VKT, which is vehicle kilometers traveled, increases proportionate to highways. That's like saying if you build a road, it'll get filled. So the law of congestion basically means that if we build more roads, they will get used. They don't relieve congestion, okay? You can't build your way out of congestion. It's been, I can go over this in more detail if you give me a bit of time, but there was another paper by a man named Todd Littman, I think, who's come here, talked to us about things, and he said the same thing, basically, that generated traffic reduces the predicted congestion reduction benefits. That's a polite way of saying it doesn't reduce congestion. It also imposes costs, which include downstream congestion, accidents, parking costs, pollution, and other environmental impacts. And that's what we sometimes call induced demand. Okay, that's this whole notion of induced demand. And the third point is that really we keep producing roads so people do the marginal value trips because they're there, the roads are there. What's not clear is that congestion is necessary. Congestion forces consumers, drivers, to make decisions about transportation modes. We've never given anybody any excuse to not use a single occupancy vehicle.
1 minute.
Okay. And I just wanted to get to, the standard definition of traffic. You're never stuck in traffic, you are traffic. We talked about the future of urban transportation, and I think the future is really quite different. It's difficult to predict, but Anthony Fox, who was the U.S. Secretary of Transportation in the Obama administration, said that the reality about transportation is that it is future-oriented. If we're planning for what we have, we are behind the curve. And I'll stop here at this infogram that tells you, talks about 3 revolutions. So there's the left-hand side, which is business as usual, and that's what we're heading for. And we will result, the planet Earth has roughly about 1 billion cars right now in 2010. We will double that by 2050. In the middle scenario, that's this the first part of the revolution, or they call it Revolution 2, which would be electrification of everything plus automation, so connected cars, autonomous vehicles. If we just keep doing the same mentality of single occupancy vehicles, sure, we will save, what you see on the bottom panel is what the reductions of greenhouse gases are. And in the old model, you have something like 4.6 megatons, 4,600. The middle scenario, where we only do what we do now, only with electric and connected vehicles, we drop down nicely, but it's still 1,700 megatons. This is the whole.
Thank you.
Okay, and then the final one is what we should be doing, and that's.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the committee? Seeing none. Sorry, Councillor Holland.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for the presentation. I guess I'm going to use an analogy, I think, just in that when you're talking about congestion and how we, essentially that should be the goal, that we should be increasing congestion to change behavior in order to reduce greenhouse gases ultimately, which is something I agree with. However, politically it's a little more complicated. For example, though, I guess the analogy that might be helpful, and I'll pose this as a question because I would like to know your thoughts on various alternatives to the bridge, for example. So when we have people looking to park curbside in the city, they drive around and around looking for parking, as I did on my way here, and burn gas while they do that and create greenhouse gases. And I'm not entirely sure if we're at this point yet, but there has been a recognition, at least in the city, that parking should be therefore more expensive, that we should deter people from parking there, but if we're going to deter them from parking there, we need to move them to lots a little bit further away or in the downtown, but wherever. So there's a deterrent in terms of cost, and there's an alternative. So what would you propose to facilitate this transition through to lower greenhouse gas emission altogether and through increased congestion and trying to change people's behavior? Do you have anything in mind that would sort of emulate the types of decisions that we tend to see as the best way to move forward, which is to change behavior but also provide alternatives?
Well, that's the sort of million-dollar question in urban transportation. How do you make these incentives or disincentives hit them at the right chord? And I think what most people seem to fall back to is congestion pricing. And you probably heard about London in 2002 just imposed a £8 a day charge for getting into a certain restricted area of the city. And that sounds a bit futuristic perhaps, but we have the technology. If we talked about the prevalence of smartphones and the ability to connect to vehicles and transponders and just being able to charge people for being where they are if they want to use a single occupancy vehicle and just so that it's fair that everybody pays it, then they know, well, I can't park here. And so it's the same thing you were alluding to. It's Donald Shoup is the sort of guru on parking, and he sort of worked out these principles that basically as long as you have 85% of your parking spots used, and there's always some available parking, so people don't do this cruising around blocks. You do this dynamic pricing so that your pricing is based on the 85% number, and as long as that demand is there, the price can go up, and when the demand goes down, the price goes down, and that tends to regulate the parking as a resource. So, and I think the city is working towards that, although they're not right at the point where they've got these smart parking meters that will adjust the price based on the demand. But they're almost there, and I don't think it's very far away. But congestion pricing in general is a way to control and make it. It's the same as the parking spot thing, only over the whole transportation mechanism. And so, of course, you'd have to have exemptions for people who work and people who have an obligation to be somewhere. You can do that all with smart technology, I think.
The further point, or the point worth reemphasizing, is that congestion is not necessarily a bad thing. This is not, I don't know if this is an analogy or just an instance of allowing the market, in this case, to apply pressures and send up opportunities. So there was just the presentation about a way to facilitate the use of bikes. That becomes more attractive if people are less able to get in their car and go wherever they want, whenever they want. And the second, the other part of the motion that we brought forward had to do with the technological transformation that people are talking about now, and those include things like Uber and automated vehicles. And if congestion is an issue, if congestion is putting pressure on people to find alternatives, the likelihood that they'll take up those alternatives increases. So it's not necessarily the responsibility of municipal council to figure out how it's all going to go. There are a lot of factors that will come to bear if congestion increases. The flip side of it is what we were describing. If you take as your requirement that there always be capacity to handle whatever amount of traffic might possibly arise, then you know where you're going, and it's a place that people generally think is not desirable. I could say more if you like.
Any other questions from the committee? Councillor Neal.
Just a quick question of the clerk. Will this PowerPoint presentation, can we make it available or distribute it to all of council in the next couple of days? That was a question for the clerk. We can do that? Yeah, great. Thank you.
Councillor Schell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In many of these discussions, we talk about particularly European cities where bicycles are very important and transit's very important and supported. And we do have a government here that's talking about high-speed rail between Toronto and Hamilton. But as a councillor looking at cities, one of the issues I find is you need the people to be close enough to where they want to be to use alternate modes of transport. I'm talking about intensification in the long run. You know, we have a city with all the services in the core and then people coming into the core in cars, and people working in the east, living in the west, and this constant back and forth, and people coming from the east into Queens. It's quite the travel, just like any city, but we don't seem to have an interest in the city in intensifying in the core as well, so that people can live closer to where they work and shop. So when they did it in Europe, did it come naturally? Did people fight it like they do here? How did Europe get to be so dense in their core, city cores, so that they could have high-speed transportation right inside the city? You know, right in the heart of, you'll see no cars in places, it's just transit. But that meant they got people living down there, really in intense ways. And that's part of, I find, our problem as councillors, how to persuade citizens that you also need the people living in these dense communities to make it all work, so that you can bike everywhere you want to, especially as you age. You're not going to bike 20 kilometers to work and back. I don't know if there's any answer right about this, but this is part of the conversation about things like the bridge and roads and Kingstown visioning when we're going to add roads to allow an area to intensify for business purposes, an area that's essentially empty. You know, that we're trying to work out ways. And I think what I'm trying to say is we're trying to think of transportation that makes sense, not transportation that just eases congestion. But the other side of it is trying to get people to live in these, or allow people to live in dense areas in the heart of the city, which is what I gather Europe has allowed.
So the quick, if I can jump in first, the quick answer to the Europe question is that the cities of Europe were dense to start with, and then traffic patterns have always been more challenging, and the need for alternatives has been there for quite a long time, and they've figured a lot of them out. There's more to it than that, but that's the general form of the answer to that question. There are a couple of things worth bringing into that conversation. Part of what we said is, I forget how we worded it, but essentially we have really good answers now about which we have some meaningful questions still on the data and the way the data is used and on the multiplier effect of the household survey and things like that. But we have, even if we grant all of those answers that we have from the engineers and the planners, we have a really good answer to what might still be the wrong question, because the question, as we were told by the consultant engineer who was at our last meeting, the original question in the EA was about how do we move more traffic across the Cataraqui River, the need and best way to facilitate. We said to them, you know, this old saw, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's more than that. We said to them, give us something we can hit with a hammer. And so that's been the tenor of that's been the topic of the conversation ever since. And it comes directly to your question about how do we get people to behave differently and so on. Part of the answer to that is we look at it with the same determination and with the same dedication of resources that we've been looking at the bridge. This is relevant. I'm, as a member of KIEF on the North Kingstown Committee, and I keep saying, and doesn't really get traction in that discussion, and I understand why, but I keep saying we want everyone we hear speak to that committee, people from the public and people within that committee, everyone, I think without exception, says we want what I've been calling semi-autonomous neighborhoods. We want communities, we want walkable destinations, we want intensification, we want commerce, we want people living where they work. Everybody says that. And then I say, but we also have in the background of that conversation the ongoing will not die conversation about the Wellington Street extension. And we've been told specifically that we can't discuss the bridge and John Counter. So my contribution in an ongoing way to that conversation is how can we talk about creating meaningful neighborhoods in a place that you're talking about wrapping in arterial roads? You're going to say to people by your decisions, don't look for walkable destinations, retail, and work here because we're providing you the means to get easily elsewhere. That's an important part of this discussion, and as it bears directly on the bridge, no one has, as far as I know, said what is the root problem that the bridge would address. And I would say the root problem is you have too many people on one side of the river wanting to go to the other side. That isn't necessarily best answered by saying, okay, here's your method of transportation, whether it's the 401 or a ferry, or I would say the better kind of answer would be give people the services they want on that side of the river so that they don't have to go 20 miles across town to the Home Depot, and give people at this end, I don't think there's anything anybody wants on that side of the river that they cross for except jobs, but that level of discussion is appropriate, and the resources that it would take are also appropriately spent, and I think all of that answers your question.
Thank you. Councillor Schell, can you take the chair?
Yes, take the chair and recognize you.
Thank you. My question, when I had to read this a few times, and I felt as though there wasn't as much content that there could have been in there, and hearing you say that there was a unique situation, which happens in life generally, that every now and then. Are you confident bringing this to council the way it is written right now? Because I feel like it's incredibly sparse with very vague information. It would be very difficult, I think, to get behind something like this the way it's written. I'm not sure how you would feel about that comment. My feelings are that it's difficult to get behind this with the way it's written. And if I'm not going to support it, I figured I may as well ask you the question directly. That's kind of a feeling that I myself may have.
Sorry, what was the very last part of what you said?
I just figured I'd ask you directly to hear your response, that the way it's written is so vague, and there aren't really strong points in it. It's, there's electric vehicles, Uber-like services. It seems very vague and broad, trying to give us direction on something that's quite significant. It may require something significantly more robust than this. What is your response to that?
My response would meaningfully be the thing you prefaced that with. We didn't hear about this until, and we weren't in, we said, can we talk about this, and can we get in here? And then there was an attempt to schedule a meeting that didn't work, and then another meeting was scheduled over ours, and there should have been more time where KIEF was asked, in my view, where KIEF and therefore EITP were given the opportunity to look at this plan and bring meaningful comment to it. That's the first part. And so the fact that we didn't have that time is a fact, and I don't think it's a shortcoming on our part, frankly. If there was, then it's me, and someone could tell me what I should have done, and in the future I'd do it better, but that's not really how I feel about it. There's that. I think the points that we boiled things down to in the conversation we had, at our last meeting where we looked at this specifically, there was another whole question about something else. We decided, no, that's not relevant. We don't want to bring that forward. And then we listened carefully because, what's his name? Frank? No, the project manager? Project manager for the bridge.
Dan Franco.
Dan Franco was there, and we listened carefully to what he said about these and other comments that were brought forward. And at the end of that, we said, that's partly what I just said about very good answers. If you grant all of it and say a very good answer came forward, we still have the, I think, very pointed observation that it's quite possible the wrong question is still the only one under consideration, and I'm not aware of any attempt to answer the wider question. So I think our observation that the wrong question is perhaps about to be answered with a commitment of a lot of money is important and telling. And I don't think it needs to be incumbent upon us to say, you still haven't asked the fundamental question. So you're about to make a decision based on what's possibly the wrong question. That's the one thing. And the thing about the second point about imminent change is, again, it comes partly to our not having enough time to give you all the examples that we might have, but I don't think it's a controversial thing to say that there's a lot of change right now on the near horizon for transportation, and it's quite possible that the context within which the decision we're faced with has changed, and that would be our further observation. So, does that answer your question? Have I changed your mind?
Councillor Shaw. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I believe that's everything. Thank you. Moving on, we only have one business item A. So the Kingston Environmental Advisory reports and recommends as follows, whereas the Kingston Environmental Advisory Forum mandate is to advise council on strategic priorities and advise them on emerging issues and future priorities, and whereas the investment in infrastructure, planning, and livable city, greening the city, and the third crossing are strategic priorities for council. First, a bridge is an answer to the 2004 KTMP question whether there is a need to accommodate additional transportation capacity across the Cataraqui River. A bridge may not be the answer to the deeper question of how to reduce car reliance and demand for cross-city transportation. Before committing to a third crossing, it is worthwhile investigating meaningful alternative urban planning options to reducing traffic, congestion, and greenhouse gas emissions associated with the above. A decision now regarding the third crossing is poorly timed in that there are technical changes imminent that will likely impact traffic patterns like electric vehicles, Uber-like services, ride-sharing, transport management changes, and autonomous vehicles. Do I have a mover for the motion? Councillor Neal, seconded by Councillor Holland. And do we have any discussion? Councillor Neal.
I have a few questions, if I might, to staff. I know that when we've talked about the 401 and the impact on local traffic, and this has gone on since the 90s, we're always told that the 401 is not meant for local traffic. But the reality is, all along the 401 corridor, local traffic utilizes, for efficiency reasons, the 401. And I know the province has just spent $160-some million to widen that. Have we taken that into account when we looked at the needs assessment for third crossing?
Through you, Mr. Chair, and I know that question has come on a number of different occasions as it relates to Highway 401 and not just the existing capacity of a 4-lane highway, but the future state of a 6-lane section that will extend between Montreal in the west and Highway 15 in the east. The very quick and easy answer to your question is yes, it has been factored into the modeling work that the city has done. So it takes into account any of the intra-city traffic. So that would be trips that are matching origins and destinations within the city of Kingston. It takes into account any of the traffic that would be using the 401.
Has that been modeling, or has it actually been traffic count, identifying license plates as Greater Kingston travelers? Have we drilled down to that level?
So I'll need to go back and check with my group, but my understanding is that no, we have not been able to do any license plate surveys in order to understand whether or not we actually have X number of vehicles that are traveling between, interchange Montreal Street and Highway 15. But again, we do have that information as it relates to information through the modeling work. And I would indicate that the model is a calibrated model, so it's yielding good results in that respect. That we would have some confidence in terms of what that intra-city volume would be that would be using the 401.
And I remember, in 2011 or perhaps it was 2012, we looked at some plans for trying to mitigate the traffic flow across the causeway. And one of the things we looked at and was strongly encouraged at the time was a roundabout at number 2 and number 15. And I was quite hopeful that we would get that roundabout and then take another look at the traffic flow. Where do we stand with that? And wouldn't that mitigate some of those issues on the causeway?
So Councillor Neal is correct in that circa 2011, I believe it was 2012, we did the capacity optimization exercise for the Highway 2 corridor. And that looked at what the possible options were to try to maximize the capacity of that particular crossing using the LaSalle Causeway. And there were a number of different items that were recommended to make those improvements. At a granular level, they included traffic signal timing, some synchronization between intersections. One of the more physical improvements that was put into place was the extension of the eastbound left turn lane at Highway 2 and 15. And then you're correct, is that one of the longer term recommendations was to look at a roundabout at Highway 2 and 15. So as we speak, the city is also working on an environmental assessment for Highway 15. And so that is looking at in terms of what are going to be the solutions to look at improving the capacity and that traffic moving along the Highway 15 corridor. Wrapped up into that exercise is looking specifically at the intersection of Highway 2 and 15. One of the options is a roundabout, and so that is moving forward. The other option is to look at intersection improvements that are going to be required there to match the capacity. I should say that both of these projects work in concert. So your transportation system improvements are looking at a network improvements. We're not looking at these projects in an isolated manner, in that we just draw a box around Highway 15 and the intersection of Highway 2 and 15 and say, that's an isolated project, and we look with blinders on with that. And then we turn around and we look at a third crossing and we analyze that in isolation. These projects are being fit together and they're being analyzed in that manner. So the improvements that will occur with the Highway 15 projects would be complementary to work that would happen with the third crossing and vice versa.
I guess, and we've had this conversation, privately before. I guess I would feel more confident in the need identified or supposed need for a third crossing if we had taken those steps towards mitigating the traffic flow and then done an assessment. So looked at the widening of the 401, looked at a roundabout after it had been built, did a careful traffic analysis, and then seen if that didn't lower the need to a level that, because a roundabout and synchronizing lights is a hell of a lot cheaper than building a bridge. And so personally, I wish that we had embraced all of those mitigating efforts initially. So, and I have one more comment.
So again, the environmental assessment for Highway 2 and 15 is moving that project forward. I don't foresee any reason why those improvements won't be ultimately implemented. The one thing I will draw your attention to is that the final conclusions of that capacity optimization study that was done in 2011, 2012 concluded that even with all of those improvements being made along the Highway 2 corridor, including the roundabout at 2 and 15, it still wasn't going to be sufficient to negate the need for the third crossing.
And finally, I guess, and this is none of us have a crystal ball, so it's really difficult. But I continue to have some fear that what we're building is a bridge that fits more readily with the 1980s, 1990s concept of future traffic needs. And with the advent of self-driving cars, which are supposed to make traffic more efficient, and electric cars, and greater car sharing, we may end up building a bridge that was possibly justified in the 1990s that may not be justified in 2030, but it's an infrastructure cost that will go forward. I remember seeing a picture of Times Square in something like 1904 or something, and there were like 2 cars in the picture, and the rest were all horse and buggy. And just a decade later, it was a totally different picture. And I'm wondering if, my fear is that we're spending money that in future we may find diminishing need for a third crossing, but we'll have to service the debt. We'll have the additional upkeep infrastructure. How did you kind of square that whole idea of future technology?
Councillor, I think it is, it's an excellent question. I think Council has provided staff with some very good direction in that regard. I also think staff is very aware of what the potential for the future might look like. Kingston is actually a participant in a provincial organization, which Council asked us to seek participation in. The acronym is MCAVO, which is the Municipal Alliance for Autonomous and Connected Vehicles, a group of municipalities that are really trying to see and look into and peer into what the future may look like. You couple that with even things that were identified in your last 2015 Transportation Master Plan, which touched on many of the issues that the delegates spoke about, which is continuing to pursue work on transportation systems management. You know, we are believers that we're going to actually be able to find more capacity within the transportation system, and there may be technology that's going to enable that. But I think we still see an efficacy in the third crossing that can still fit with all of that. you are still going to have a piece of infrastructure that still enables autonomous and connected vehicles to use that, or transit, or active transportation. All the things that I think we are going to anticipate to be markers of a future transportation system for our community.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments from the committee? Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going back to the question of the modeling regarding 401 use. You and I have discussed this many times in the past. And I asked you, last time we talked, what, 2.5 months ago, a couple of months ago, whether we had actually done the test, which you again said today that we have not, about how much 401 usage there really is. So my first question is that you've changed the modeling program from TransCAD, right, which you started out with, to, I can't remember the acronym, but it's a different one. And so, and I take it that you got more or less the same results. But the question I think is really important here is the modeling program gives you hypothetical probabilities, but we haven't tested them. We haven't done the work to say this is actually what is happening. And so to me, that seems rather unscientific. And I've actually in the past done some work on that sort of thing about testing hypotheses and so on. So I'm wondering how you respond to that, because we don't know. We're dealing with a model, which is a series of algorithms that give you the probabilities of something, but they don't actually test it against reality. That's an extra step. And it's an extra step which I've been recommending for years. I mean, going back like 8 years or something. And personally, I think it's the responsible thing to do. So I'm just wondering what you would say to that.
First off, Councillor, I would agree is that much like any model, it is used to make future forecasts. And so there is always going to be that notion that a model is basically used for that purpose. Our traffic consultant will actually be with council as part of the special council meeting to be held next week. And we can certainly expand more in terms of how the model is being prepared, how the model is being calibrated. The traffic engineer's opinions as it relates to that calibration and that verification process for the model, and how well it is actually working and serving as a predictor for future traffic volumes within the city of Kingston.
Okay, so no, I don't mean any offense, but to me we have not tested it.
That's not correct. So the city continues to take traffic counts at a variety of different locations across the city. So those traffic counts are being done on an ongoing, continual basis, and those do serve as a means by which we can actually do that process of both calibrating and verifying the model. So I would caution you to say that no, it's not that we just create a model and we don't test it against everything. We do have an ability to test it against measurements that we're taking on traffic volumes out in the field on an ongoing and regular basis.
Okay, that's fair enough, okay? But the answer to the question, have we done the counts of how many cars are using the 401, was no. It was no 2 months ago, and it was no tonight. So that's the crucial number. How many vehicles are actually using the 401 that are coming from mostly the east side and going back And, you know, anecdotally, you as well as I, but just talking to people I know, they're doing it all the time. And I've talked to people and they've come to the conclusion, well, it would be nice to have the bridge, but I guess it's a convenience. That's a quote, actually. And just people that come from the east side to visit one, right? And how long it's taken them. I grant you all your planning is about into the future. But if we haven't done the counts of how many cars are actually using it, then it seems to me that there's a lacuna there. There's a gap in our knowledge, which would serve as a test.
So a couple of things there. One is that more of a qualitative response to that is that there's no disagreement. The Highway 401 is actually a well-used corridor that carries an awful lot of that intra-city traffic that is crossing the Cataraqui River. And in fact, the modeling results actually show that of all of the crossings, which is carrying traffic, your 401 corridor is actually carrying a fairly significant volume of traffic across the Cataraqui River. The second point is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, the model is actually well calibrated, so it wouldn't necessarily cause us any point of concern to say, well, we're overly concerned about those volume estimates or forecasts that are coming from the model. The issue with actually trying to do measurements on the 401 is it is more complicated than actually just trying to take measurements on city-owned streets. Yes, we can try to do some inferences at interchanges, but it becomes an awful lot more complicated to know whether or not those vehicles that, let's say, are exiting at the Highway 15 interchange are truly just city traffic or if they are intercity traffic. So it's a little bit more of a more complicated exercise, but again, I would suggest that the model is well calibrated and we don't have any reasons to have concern as it relates to the volume estimates that are being carried on the 401.
Okay. Okay, I would just say this, that response, this is such an issue because J.L. Richards said, as Councillor Neal indicated, this is going back to like 2008, I think. They said that 401 was not to be used by local traffic. We know that is not true now. There was an article in the Kingston Life magazine where they quoted the representative of the Ministry of Transportation, and they said quite clearly, we don't care what kind of traffic it is. We don't get into that. We just know we have to carry the capacity or build for the future, or however you want to look at it. And so that's what they do. So for me, having been asking for this for I don't know, 9 years. I'm not, it just bothers me that, I'm sorry, I just don't think it's been done right. The other question I have is, one of the things that have been suggested by people who live on the east side, even, and other people, is why we would not look at the, did we take into account, I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. Did we take into account the Gore Street extension through the military base and out to the 401? That's been recommended by people that actually live on the east side, like politicians, former politicians. Did we take that into account?
Sorry, Councillor, you said which extension?
Gore Road, the Gore Road extension. You know how it goes up where the bridge is going to come across, and that's Gore Road, which you perfectly well know. The idea has been for like decades that a parallel road to 15 would run through the military base out to the 401 so that military traffic and others, whoever wanted to use it, could miss the whole Highway 15, Highway 2 interchange, and that would relieve congestion on that side. And I realize that systematically that's not everything you have to take into account. But as far as that's concerned, it's always seemed to me that's a way cheaper than a bridge. I'll just say, which I've said to you on a number of occasions, to me, we should be doing everything possible not to build the bridge because it's cheaper, among other things, way cheaper. So, and also addresses all these other environmental issues. Building a road is not so bad, but not so good, but at least it's addressing some of the issues. So did we take into the account that concept?
So the road extension through the CFB lands was actually a concept that was being pursued by the base. I'm going to say probably about 8 years ago, maybe 6 to 8 years ago. And even at that point in time, they had commenced basically the equivalent of their environmental assessment to look at possible options for the routing of that internal road that would basically make a connection from Highway 2 in the south up to Gore Road in the north. With some change in leadership at the base, that option or that opportunity has been taken off the table. And there has been no expressed intent of bringing that as an option back on the table. So that is not something that is being further brought forward in terms of contemplation. It actually probably has more of a bearing in terms of the environmental assessment that's occurring for Highway 15 as opposed to direct implications for the third crossing. But in any event, that was a discussion that was occurring with CFB Kingston at the time, but not on the table at this point.
Fair enough. The leadership at CFB has changed a couple of times since then, though. But we've never picked up the discussion with them. I think the connection to congestion relative to the third crossing is how do you get traffic into the base, the largest employer on that side, and in the city, actually. And so that addresses that issue in part. So that's the rationale behind it. But what you're saying then is, would you agree that we haven't looked at it in a number of years? And even though I think they change the commandant like every 2 or 3 years, right?
I can recheck with my staff that is actually being guiding those discussions on the Highway 15 EA. But again, it's my understanding at this point, Councillor, that there has not been any interest from the base to go back to be re-exploring that option of having an interior road within their property.
Fair enough, thank you. I would just say that it would be in our interest to partner with them. That's what I always thought was involved. The services on the south side was mentioned as part of the drive, the need to cross the river, or at least lessening the amount of need to cross the river. We know that there's a plaza going in on the east side now, which will have some of the services that East Siders have been looking for a long time, decades. One of the other things that I think we've taken into account is I've never understood why we didn't address the emergency issue by building a medical facility, although I suppose the military has a hospital over there. So did we take that into account? I mean, that wasn't in the beginning, that wasn't even on the table, but it is now. They're building it as we speak. So
in answer to your question, Councillor, and again, this takes us back to that higher level issue of land use planning and how that has been incorporated into the work that has basically gotten us to this point in time. And again, the transportation model is based upon looking at population and employment growth and how that population employment growth is forecast to occur within the city over the course of the next 20-year period in time. And it isn't just the total aggregate numbers in terms of new growth in terms of population and employment, but it's also geographically where that is going to occur within the city. And that information is used to inform that transportation or that traffic model that we have to then make predictions in terms of where those trips are going to take place. So I caution you that it isn't just one specific development that is occurring that will either validate or remove the need. I think you need to consider that this is going to be population and employment growth and development that is going to occur over the course of the next 20-year period in time. That's the information that's feeding into the traffic model. That's what we're using to look at the requirements and the needs for the transportation in the city.
Thank you.
Any further questions from the committee? Councillor Schell, could you take the chair?
I take the chair and I recognize you.
Thank you. I guess the only comments I'd make are that, as I expressed to the delegation, I feel like the wording of this particular motion is not necessarily a positive reflection on Keefe, I think. And I understand that there was time restraints, and I think we've all gone through different scenarios in our lives where things kind of happen a bit frantically towards the tail end of something, or you get short notice or what have you. But my concern is that looking at this, if it was articulated in a very strong way that even I didn't agree with, I would still support it because it's giving valid arguments. There's many valid arguments, and I'm glad I asked the question of the delegation because I think that they gave a good response that had valid points. But I personally believe that those points are valid towards the city in its entirety as best practices to get people from using motorized vehicles and what have you. I don't think it's specifically a third crossing issue. And I think that as an entire community, we should look at some of the points that were raised by the delegation in order to get people to get away from motorized vehicles. The problem is living in Kingston and experiencing some of the traffic issues with not having modes of transportation to and from the east side has become quite a significant problem. That's my stance. We may agree to disagree. Even though I may not be supporting this, I do want to acknowledge that there are some very good arguments and some very good things that are coming out of this that will improve the city. We may just agree to disagree. So having said that, I just think that even though I likely will not be supporting this because I don't think I'm not confident bringing this to council. Those are the reasons why I won't be supporting it, but it doesn't mean that I discredit the intent or some of the goals of that particular organization. So that's my piece.
Thank you, and I return the chair.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no other questions or comments, we'll call to vote. All those in favor? Opposed? And that passes 3-2. We have no other motions. We have no notices of motions. We have no other business. We have no correspondence. The date of our next meeting will be held on Tuesday, July 4th, 2017. Having said that, I'll look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Neal, followed by Councillor Holland. What's that? Oh, all those in favor? And that passes unanimously.